my pleasure to welcome you today to this event on the rise of Gulf Arab cities. Our main speaker, a good friend, Sultan Al-Qasimi, is a renowned commentator, a columnist, art collector, troublemaker, a disruptor, and blogger with a very large regional and global following. Our moderator will introduce him formally, and I will introduce him in a moment. I only want to use this occasion to warmly welcome Sultan as one of our newest MEI-affiliated scholars. We're very thrilled and honored to have him, and we look forward certainly to hosting more events with him, publishing his work, and working with him on art, politics, and other issues. The Middle East Institute would also like to encourage you to register and attend our upcoming conference this coming Monday at the National Press Club from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. This event commemorates the 25 years since Operation Provide Comfort, the U.S.-led humanitarian intervention in northern Iraq in 1991. The conference will look at the lessons learned from that experience, what has happened and what's transpired. Can any of it be applicable to today or tomorrow's Middle East? You can find details about this conference on our website, mei.edu. This event itself will be videotaped, and Monday morning or tomorrow morning will be on our website both as video and podcast audio. Also, feel free to tweet or do anything else during the event. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, Mr. David Rothkopf. David is one of the most respected and frequently consulted foreign affairs experts in Washington today. He's the CEO and editor of the FP Group, which publishes Foreign Policy magazine. He also heads the international advisory group or advisory firm, Garton Rothkopf. His writings appear in FP and many other outlets. He's published a number of acclaimed books, including National Insecurity, American Leadership in an Age of Fear, which came out in 2014. We're very pleased to have him here to introduce this presentation and to engage with our speaker, and following that, lead a discussion with you. David, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here on many levels. But most notably and most differently, I participate in lots and lots of discussions about the Middle East that tend to focus on what I consider to be kind of small bore events. In other words, events of today, events of yesterday, events of small groups, events that are not of consequence towards the long arc of history. I, in fact, think that we have spent much of the past 15 years since 9/11 defining the Middle East, defining our relationships, actually defining much of American foreign policy in terms of our fears of some bad actors who can have a significant but limited impact. And while it's worthy to talk about those things, what's great about this session is that it's looking further. It's looking at issues in the longer arc of history, issues that are going to be relevant not just to the evolution of the Middle East, but that are actually relevant to the evolution of the entire planet. I personally am of the belief that if you look at a global economy 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the engines of growth and the linchpins of that economy are much more likely to be hubs than they are countries. Cities that have transportation infrastructure, information infrastructure, financial infrastructure, and human infrastructure that connect them to other such hubs. You know, we're only 10 years away from a world, possibly less, that for the first time in history, every human being will be connected in a man-made system. In other words, by the cell phone or their laptop, they will connect to everybody else. There'll be one cultural ecosystem, one economic ecosystem, one political ecosystem. And the the engines of intellectual activity, economic activity in that system are much more likely to be these hubs. And if you were to go and look around the world and say, where are these hubs evolving? Who are the leaders? You might look to some of the new cities of China, although there was a good cautionary tale on that front in the New York Times a couple of days ago, because cities are being built that don't actually have people in them. But I would say that of all the cities in the world that capture this idea the best, Dubai may be at the top of the list. And certainly Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha are among the cities you would count on that list. And if you look at a city like Dubai, you know, the first thing you're struck by is the awesome physical infrastructure of the city. But what makes Dubai interesting is not the physical infrastructure. It's the human infrastructure. What makes the Emirates different from all the other countries in the region is, in fact, that it is a country that has chosen to make as the foundation of its power thought leadership rather than pumping a resource out of the ground. And that has led to a remarkable change in priorities. And you see that in Dubai. You see a city where 86% of the population is expat. It is truly a global city. You see a city where every year the government organizes an event for the rest of the world on what is the future of governance. You see innovations, whether it's using apps or having government officials, when they become a minister, being given an iPad that shows how they're performing versus the other ministers in the government. You see innovation taking place. You also see a city and a country where 90+% of the women graduate high school, where the majority of people in the university are women, where there are more women in the cabinet than there are in the US cabinet, and where everything from military missions to the Mars mission are being led by women. So it is a place where innovation is happening at a remarkable pace. And that innovation, because it's a hub, is touching the rest of the world. And it's changing the countries around it that have been slow to change. And it's offering a model for a region that is in need of a model, but it also connects to India, and it connects to China, and it connects to Europe, and it connects to Africa, and it connects to the US. And this is a remarkable development. And I think we're especially lucky today to have one of the most prominent thought leaders in a country that has made thought leadership its unique selling proposition in Sultan, here to talk about this idea. You may know him from his activities in the Twitterverse. You may know him from his writings, which have included writings in foreign policy, which we are grateful for and hope there's more to come. You may know him from other speeches. He's extremely well known. But he is part of a new generation of leaders who are thinking zero-based. They are thinking, what are the models we need and how do we create those, rather than thinking of the past and incremental change on that. And that's why this is exciting, because this is a conversation about global changes that are actually being born in a region of the world where we think of setbacks and not progress. So please join me in welcoming Sultan.
Thank you, David, for that extremely generous introduction. I'm trying to keep my speech as short as possible, so I'm going to jump right in. Yes, it does work. So this is an image of Dubai in 1990 and 2013. You can just, keep this in the back of your mind as I go through the slides. This is Sheikh Zayed Road, which is the main artery of Dubai, where the financial center is and a lot of commercial buildings are. So I first suggested the proposition that Gulf cities are emerging as major hubs in 2013. This article had dozens of responses all over the world. For example, some of them weren't really very happy about it. I got the Shoe of the Month award, which I actually don't mind. But let me just give you a background about these Gulf cities. So these are about 7 or 8 cities in the Gulf countries whose population is about 50 million. So the population of the Gulf states is 50 million, of which 25 million are, foreign workforce that send back about $80 billion in remittances a year. $80 billion. They form about 15% of the world foreign workforce. It's one of the major hubs in the world for where foreigners go and work. Of course, Saudi Arabia being the biggest, about 10 million expatriates or immigrant workers live and work in Saudi Arabia. And the UAE and Qatar obviously are the highest in terms of percentage of foreign workforce. Let's see. So the issue is, I suggested here in 2013 another article to give them some additional rights, but there's always a fear and apprehension in the back of people's minds that they would organize protests and demonstrations, as we have had a number of times across the Gulf states. So obviously there has been an expansion in these Gulf cities and these Gulf states in terms of civic participation. So for example, Saudi Arabia last year, the first time they allow women to vote, which was, I think, a great step, although these are mostly non-legislative powers. The UAE has a wonderful, I think, initiative that allowed for the first time in any Gulf city for expatriates and migrant workforce to vote in Chamber of Commerce elections. So it was the first time ever that Indian and Arab individuals ran in the Abu Dhabi Chamber of Commerce in 2009 and again in 2014, and they won. It was very interesting because they did lobbying and they did a lot of things that we sort of recognize here in the U.S. Well, the Gulf states like to think that they have a unique model of democracy, the Majlis kind of democracy, where Majlis are these salons where people gather and they lobby each other. This is mostly effective, I think, in Kuwait, although we see it also in Bahrain and also in the UAE over the past few years since elections started to be allowed. That people are using these majlises to go and lobby for votes. The Gulf states obviously are some of the richest countries in the world. In terms of oil, they control 30% of the total known oil reserves, about 500 billion barrels of oil. Of course, oil isn't doing as well as we'd like it to do in the Gulf. Now about $50 a barrel or so, which means that the Gulf cities have lost about $300 billion in potential income that we have lost over the past year or so. Having said that, we haven't stopped diversifying energy resources. Abu Dhabi has a major initiative where they would want to have a zero or a neutral carbon footprint city known as Masdar City. So despite the fact that these Gulf cities are major oil energy hubs, they're trying to diversify away from oil. Dubai also has a major initiative, solar energy, for example, and other initiatives in order to going towards sustainability. Abu Dhabi also signed a major agreement with South Korea, $20 billion worth. Mind you, for those who follow, foreign policy, a French consortium and an American consortium lost to a South Korean consortium. So Pivot to Asia, I think we beat you guys a few years. So it's a major initiative with the South Korean civilian plant. The Gulf states, so if you look at the Arab world modern history, we traditionally were getting our news from BBC Arabic, for example, radio, which was broadcasting in the 1930s from London, and then Abdel Nasser in Egypt launched Sawt al-Arab, or the Voice of the Arabs, in the 1950s and 60s, so the Gulf citizens, people in Gulf cities used to tune into Sawt al-Arab and to get their news. But fast forward 50 years, people from across the Arab world are watching. I don't think people use radio as much as I do, but watching satellite TV that's based in the Gulf cities. Whether you agree or disagree with the politics of these channels, these are major influential channels. Al Jazeera, for example, has, at the peak of Al Jazeera, they had over 150 million, 180 million viewers. Al Arabiya, based in Dubai, Sky News Arabia, based in Abu Dhabi. These are major influencers when it comes to media. The Gulf states have also become major political hubs. So these Gulf cities have really almost displaced major capitals in the Arab world, such as Cairo, with regards to diplomacy. Obama, for instance, visited Riyadh 4 times. I think almost more than any other American leader before him has been to Riyadh 4 times, and also and many other foreign leaders visit Abu Dhabi regularly, and Dubai, of course, as well as Doha and other cities in the Gulf. Of course, the biggest news emerged when Muscat had negotiated the Iranian nuclear agreement very quietly. So basically a country that didn't have independence until the early 1970s is now negotiating major deals between a regional power and PEEP 5+1 states. Of course, the Gulf states have also done a lot of diplomacy with regards to freeing hikers and roles that you would assume that other countries and other cities in the region, in the Middle East, would have discussed. My favorite point now, turning to culture and art, Doha, believe it or not, is where the most important museum of Islamic art in the world, standalone building, exists. So who would have imagined, unfortunately, in Cairo, terrorists attacked, or not directly, but indirectly had placed a bomb near the beautiful Cairo Islamic Art Museum, thereby destroying a lot of the cultural treasures inside. That being said, today, again, the #1 museum for Islamic art, and maybe one of the best museums in the world, I think, is the IMP designed Doha Museum of Islamic Art. Qatar has also been buying a lot of Western art, including this work by Cezanne, the card players, probably $250 million. They also bought this gorgeous work by Egypt's Mahmoud Said for $2.5 million. Qatar, in fact, since I'm on this subject, has the biggest collection of Arab arts in the world, about 8,000 artworks. They have major Iraqi, Syrian, Lebanese, Egyptian, and North African art. So if you want to go see the best of Iraqi art, you don't go to Baghdad. Unfortunately, a lot of the art is now in Gulf cities. Obviously, other cities are doing the same. Saudi Arabia is almost completing this beautiful building called the World Cultural Center, which is due to open next year. And they're bringing a lot of art from American museums in California and elsewhere. Abu Dhabi's major game changer, I think, when the Louvre opens next year, is going to change everything, because this is a major brand. The cultural landscape will change in the Middle East when the Louvre opens, again, designed by French architect Jean Nouvel. The Guggenheim, obviously, by Frank Gehry, Canadian-American architect, hasn't been awarded yet, but I'd like to show you that as these museums are being announced, people are using them as opportunities in the Gulf states to air their grievances. So for example, you have in America this group that is calling for greater rights, and they're using these museums as an opportunity to air their grievances and to demand additional rights. The Gulf states are today major global financial hubs. Put together, the Gulf states' economies are about $2 trillion economy. This means that they are really in the number 13, 14 position in the world. If they had united economically like the EU, they would be the 13th or between 13th and 15th biggest economy in the world, depending on which ranking IMF or World Bank That means that these cities, most of whom did not gain independence 40, 50 years ago, are the 13th biggest economy in the world. It actually is quite impressive. They also control some of the biggest sovereign wealth funds in the world. So between Saudi, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, and Qatar, there's about $2 trillion in sovereign wealth fund, which they use, by the way, for their own influence. And I'll come back to this, keep this in mind, how the Gulf states use the sovereign wealth fund to push for their own interests around the world. Unfortunately, wars such as the war in Yemen means that these Gulf states have to dip into their savings, basically. Saudi Arabia, for instance, sold about or liquidated about $100 billion of its sovereign wealth fund last year, and today there was news that they had liquidated some more. This means that a lot of contracts are being cancelled, which we hope will be reversed now that oil has gone back to $50 or so. Gulf states, again, cities that didn't exist as independent cities less than 50 years ago. Many of us in this room are older than these Gulf cities, modern era. I'm talking mostly or only about the men here in the room. But so, for example, these cities are now hosting global events. It is unheard of. There are other cities in the Middle East and North Africa that tried to host the World Cup and failed. 14 to 8 was the vote that Qatar got for the rights to host the 2022 World Cup. And no doubt, keep this in mind, that when Qatar was lobbying these countries, regardless of what you hear in the news, they did promise them. They promised them investments. They promised them, hey, listen, if you vote for us, we'll invest in your country. We'll fly directly to your country. We will, we will trade with you. So they're using their soft power in order to gain real influence and major events. Again, with every time the Gulf states try to advance, there's always a sort of a pushback from whether it's media, whether it's activists, which isn't always bad, by the way, because it's always good to be reminded by things that you need to do. Bahrain, for example, for 12 years now, they've been hosting the Formula One, one of the most successful races, but also it's another event that is used by opposition, for example, to air their grievances. Still, 2 of the Gulf cities are hosting major Formula One events, 500 million viewers a year. Per race. Abu Dhabi, for instance, became the first city in the Middle East to host the global headquarters of an international sort of United Nations recognized organization, the IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. So before IRENA, there was no single major world organization that was headquartered. Maybe they had offices, but that was headquartered in a Middle Eastern city. But this also means that we have to, accept the attendance of people from all over the world, including countries that we don't have diplomatic relations with. And I only want to show you this because I want to kind of emphasize the point that as the Gulf states are playing in what I call the major league, they will have to abide by major league rules. It's no longer the neighborhood game. What's this? So Dubai's. This is another point I'd like to emphasize. When Dubai won the right to host the Expo 2020, there was a lot of soft diplomacy, a lot of promises of investment, a lot of promises of, we will fly to your countries, we will invest in your countries, we will welcome you, we will facilitate visas for your people. Dubai again hosting the World Expo 2020, unimaginable 20 years ago for a city in the Gulf, desert city, to host the Expo 2020. That said, there's been with regards to military, I've noticed there's been a military shift. These Gulf cities are positioning themselves as military hubs as well. Bahrain, in addition to the Qatari American base that was opened about 12 years ago or so, Bahrain has re-invited the British for the first time since they withdrew from the east of the Suez in the 1960s and 70s. Bahrain has invited the British to open a base. Abu Dhabi has invited a French base, and Qatar has opened the first base since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire from Turkey. So these cities are also diversifying their military interests, and they're not only relying now on the US, but they're going towards Europe and the larger world. The Gulf states are obviously major military powers, as I said. they are involved in a number of conflicts in the region, but this also means that we sort of have to live with real world repercussions. That as soon as you you try and influence the regional dynamics, and unfortunately we live in a very dangerous neighborhood. The fact is that these are the scenes that we are seeing, that we saw in the UAE. We're very sad, of course, for that. Again, with the aid that you give to countries, it also means that wars result in destruction. I'd like to talk about Dubai being a major port hub. Dubai, obviously, Dubai is I think DP World is the world's number 4 or 5 biggest ports operator. 90% of world trade goes through sea freight. 90%, and Dubai is the 4th or 5th biggest marine terminal operator in the world. And in 2006, Dubai tried to operate ports here in America. I'm not sure if you guys remember what happened, but there was major blowback from US ports. But guess what? 10 years later, a Sharjah-based company is already managing ports in Florida. And Charles Schumer and Hillary Clinton didn't mention it in any of their speeches, which is not a bad thing. The Gulf states are also the world's major airline hubs. 3 of the world's top 5, maybe top 10 airlines in the world are based between Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Doha. In fact, it's become so contentious that the American airlines accuse them of having an unfair advantage over them. One of the reasons why they're so popular is that they're carrying about 1 million Indian passengers between America and between South Asia. So between them, it's about 33%, about a third of the South Asian traffic from America to South Asia goes through these Gulf cities. Dubai, of course, now is the world's busiest hub. An airport that didn't exist 50 years ago is the busiest airport in the world. It is no longer Heathrow. It is no longer Charles de Gaulle or Schiphol or other airlines. Again, I want to show you an example that I really like about how when something stands in the way of these Gulf cities' ambitions, they come out with guns blazing. They come out with all their influence. When Abu Dhabi tried to get landing rights to Berlin, the German bureaucracy really stood in its way. But what they did was that they went and they bought a third or so of Air Berlin. So they used their sovereign wealth fund, they used their funds, and they bought access. They broke through the German bureaucracy by using their brains and using their wallets, basically. And again, Abu Dhabi became the first city in the Middle East, even before Tel Aviv, even before major non-NATO allies for the US, to get pre-clearance in 2014. Again, the Gulf states are using their financial powers to invest in major buy trophy assets across Europe, but I won't go into this now. But they own a large chunk of London realty and elsewhere. Don't forget the influence that Mecca has for Riyadh. Riyadh, as an influence of soft power, Mecca is where 1.5 billion Muslims, I'm not sure if they all pray, but if they pray, they would direct themselves towards Mecca. And this is a major tool of soft power. So not only the 59 countries of the OIC, but every country in the world where there's a Muslim population, whether it's America, China, Canada, Europe, they all have to go meet with Saudi Arabia because of the fact that Saudi hosts Mecca. Again, the Gulf states are some of the most generous countries in the world. People don't know this, but according to the United Nations and the OECD, they give about 1.4% of their gross national income in terms of foreign aid. And what the UN recommended is 0.7. So we give more than double what the recommendation as charity and aid. In fact, I found this interesting statistic or number where the World Bank estimates that the Gulf states have given $272 billion between 1973 and 2008. $273 billion in aid and charity. One other thing I will say, and I'm almost coming to the end of this talk, is that look at this slide. 7, according to Times Higher Education, 7 out of the Arab world's top 10 universities are Gulf universities. 7. These universities are less than 50 years old, and they're already 7 out of the top 10. This is according to Times Higher Education. Parag Khanna, I think, echoes what David Rothkopf so eloquently said earlier in his introduction remarks, that the world is being organized around cities and not countries. And what Parag Khan in Connectography, his new book, says that these Gulf cities have become like a major cluster in the world, like a necklace of pearls, he calls them. I have no reason whatsoever to include the slide from the new Star Trek Beyond that was filmed in Dubai, except the fact that I'm so excited about it, and it was filmed in Dubai. Again, unfathomable for me as an Emirati that Star Trek would be filming, somebody who grew up reading Gene Roddenberry's books, that Star Trek would be filming, and of course Star Wars was filmed in Abu Dhabi. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that breathtaking tour. I'm going to ask perhaps two questions. And then I'm going to open it to you. So I'd like to encourage everybody in the audience to think about what questions they've got for Sultan. And we'll try to get through as many as we can between now and 3:15 when we will end. I found your presentation very striking and compelling and reinforcing of many of the things that I've seen. But I guess the question that lingers largest for me listening to you is why? Why is this phenomenon taking place? Why are these countries advancing so quickly? I'll come to some of the issues that are sources of controversy shortly, but these are all countries that by if past history is any indication, ought to either be suffering from the Dutch disease. In other words, they were resource-based and they would just squander it and they wouldn't actually make these transitions. And yet I know the Emirates, for example, I think is now under 30% of its GDP is related to hydrocarbons. And I think the goal very shortly is something under 20%, maybe 17%. So they're not suffering from the Dutch disease. And they're moving very, very rapidly. So, as you note, that many of them have not been countries for more than 50 years. And when I think back on where the US was 50 years in its development, we were dependent on slavery and genocide against the locals and not really even sort of cohesive as a political entity. At that point, I don't think we'd resolve some of the basic issues of states' rights at that point. And admittedly, that was the 19th century, but there are plenty of countries in Africa and Asia that were also born in the post-colonial era that haven't had this kind of traction. So what is making these places, and in particular Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, different?
Thank you. So as you said, there's examples around the world of countries that have emerged post-World War II. Singapore, South Korea come to mind. I think what differentiates Dubai and the Gulf cities is, and this sounds cliche, but really there's a leadership element involved. That the fact that the leadership wanted and they were interested in this development, but also the fact that they were welcoming to people from across the region. So you had the brightest minds from in the Gulf cities, the brightest minds from Palestine, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Egypt, from Jordan, from Iran, from Iraq, from South Asia, from now Africa, which is really one of the newest phenomena, as well as the West. So we've had regionally the best minds came together, and they were all given an opportunity. Just look at who heads the major organizations in Dubai. The founder of the American University is a Lebanese gentleman. The head of Dubai Duty Free is a South Asian lady. The head of Etihad Airlines is an Australian gentleman. So we open up to the best talent around the world. It's a meritocracy, in addition to the locals. So there is a beautiful coming together between the expatriates and the locals. Opportunity, I think, is the major phrase here.
Well, I think that it's a very interesting thing, and it's a two-sided coin, obviously. But Can you think of an example in the history of the world where a country has bet so heavily on expatriates, where 85% of the UAE is expatriates, where a very similar number seems to be the case in Doha. Um, that's kind of remarkable. But I think it could only really have happened in the 20th and 21st centuries with transportation technologies. Um, but I don't think this model's ever been followed before.
No, I think there are similar examples. Again, 25 million out of the 50 million inhabitants of the Gulf states, of which 90% live in cities, are expatriates, are people who are not from these countries. I can think maybe, again, Singapore is one of the few examples where people came from India and from China and Malaysia, and they came together and formed this wonderful country. But it's very rare.
Obviously, the flip side of the expat coin has to do with guest workers, and there have clearly been problems with that in the Emirates and elsewhere. I was interested, the New York Times seems very committed to covering this issue. Every time I read a story on the Emirates, it could be about the weather, and 7 paragraphs down it'll say, and it was particularly bad for guest workers. Now, I'm not minimizing this issue, but it tends to almost be part of the style book to bring it up. But they actually did a piece recently on art in Dubai, in which down at the bottom they started to talk about some of the benefits this was presenting to the to guest workers, and there has been some progress. I think it's important to talk about this issue and the pace of change and what we might expect.
I think, first of all, in the UAE, I believe, the cities were really overwhelmed by the number of people who were interested to come and live there. So the fact that I think when we were independent, 60% were, in 1971 when we gained independence, 60% of the population was from the UAE, 40% was expatriate population, and now it's 90% expatriate. The fact that the development was so fast that within 25 years, it became several millions of people, especially in the last 10 years. I think now 3-4 million expatriates came. So the UAE, I think, Doha as well, and other cities, took some time in order to find their bearing, to sort of find the correct way to deal with a lot of expatriates who have moved. I think there's been a lot of improvement. There still is a long way to go. But for instance, in the last few years, the UAE has mandated that companies have to pay the expatriate workforce through electronic means. So this means that because we could not physically go and check every single company in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and elsewhere, they would make sure that all the expatriates are paid using debit card, using electronic means, and this way, when a company does not pay the guest worker, it would a red flag would pop up in the Ministry of Labor and say this company has delayed payment. So they could go shut them down. They could go fine them. There's a lot to be done, I think, but it is, you say that there's criticism. I like to take this criticism as consultancy, free consultancy. What do we need to change? What do we need to improve? What do these cities need to change? And if so many people are taking interest in it, we can take what's good for us and try to do the best of it.
Yeah, and I think it also needs to be put in the context of the remarkable accomplishments that have taken place in a very short period of time. And those accomplishments attract attention. And, one of the ways you might look at the Middle East right now is a region where there are kind of a couple of spreading viruses, one unhealthy, one perhaps a little bit more positive. And so you have a nihilistic, destructive, extremist virus that particularly goes to the parts of the region that aren't doing that well economically, that have not focused on education, that have not focused on delivering to the people. But there does seem to be a spread of this model that you're talking about in the Gulf. And the last time that I was in Dubai, somebody spoke to me about, and I could have this wrong, 2 A380s a day of flights back and forth to Saudi Arabia. And that, in fact, I've read of discussions within the Saudi government where, in fact, I recall one where someone in an inner circle discussion said something like, we should look at the model of Singapore. And somebody else said, why look at the model of Singapore? Let's look at the model of the Emirates. And you get a sense, particularly with Mohammed bin Salman and a rising generation there, that perhaps change is taking place. So I'm wondering, how contagious is this virus?
Very much so. I give you an example. For instance, Dubai started the Media City. Dubai Media City, I think about 10, 12 years ago. Media City started popping up all over the region, even in Cairo, even in Amman. So the innovation that takes place, I think primarily in Dubai, is in a positive way sort of contagious, not only to the Gulf cities. You see it in Doha, you see it in Abu Dhabi, you see it in Manama, but also you see it across the region. People want to copy Dubai's model. People want to be the Dubai of Africa and the Dubai of South Asia and the Dubai of West Africa, etc.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn to you. So I hope that all of you have questions prepared. We'll have about a half an hour for the questions. One of the terms I like least is soft power. It implies secondary or weak power. Mostly in Washington, people like things that explode and have a lot of technology involved in them and so forth. And if you ever went into a meeting in the Situation Room and said, I'd like to speak to you about love, people would ask you to leave. Or if you went in and said, I'd like to speak to you about art, people would pat you on the head and say, I'm afraid you're in the wrong room. And yet, models of tolerance, models of opportunity based on education, models of the embrace of leadership role for women, and cultural flourishing have made places like I saw, Burson Marsteller does a study of young people in the Arab world. And the place they want to be is the Emirates. Now what's more powerful? A website for ISIS or the fact that 70+% of the people want to live in this place? That's real power to me. And there's been a huge investment in the Emirates, and you talk about it here, in the arts. And you yourself run a foundation and a noted collector of art. And I'm just wondering if you would talk for a minute or two about the importance of all of that. We see the Louvre, we see the Guggenheim, but those of you who are interested in music, the Metropolitan Opera currently is selling out 66% of its seats. The Dubai Opera opened and within 3 hours sold out all of its seats for the whole season. I think the third largest music festival in the world is in the Emirates. Why? Why is that significant? And you also talk about Qatar and the Islamic Art Museum. I get a sense, and this is the end of my last question, so I'm just going to add a little bit to it. Something very profound in the history of the Middle East is happening also. These places are the new Alexandrias. The shift of intellectual life has shifted in this region. Recent events in Egypt suggest that's likely to continue for a while. So maybe you could put it in a little bit bigger context.
So, as we said, music production, filming, the museums are popping up. Unfortunately, popping up in the Gulf at the same time that they've been either shuttered in other countries in the Middle East or underfunded. For instance, maybe I'd say a couple of words about the arts market in Dubai. Dubai had 3 galleries in the 1980s or 2 galleries. Dubai today has 55 art galleries, and this sounds trivial, but this is a major source of income for Dubai. I worked with Art Dubai last year. We had 25,000 visitors in a period of 5 days. 25,000 visitors, people who flew in from across the Middle East. If you want to buy Iranian art, you come to Dubai. Dubai is the hub for Iranian art. Dubai is the hub for Arab art, for Middle East. So this gives you you become a destination. You become a reference point. People want to live in a place that where that welcomes art, that welcomes culture, that you could meet other intellectuals. Unfortunately, in some Arab countries, and I don't want to mention names, the first thing on the mind of the young people is that they want to leave. They just want to leave their country. And where do they want to go to? They want to go to Dubai, as you said. But the fact is that there is a brain drain across the Middle East, and what Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid calls the brain regain, kind of coming to Dubai. Dubai is attracting a lot of these minds, and obviously Dubai has influenced these other cities in the Gulf to mimic its example. But what Dubai did it organically. It wasn't a top bottom. It was really a grassroots effort. For a lot of people, they say, "What is this art industry? It doesn't really make any difference." But it's $1 billion industry, and it's changing. It's changing. It's bringing a lot of people. It's changing realities. It's bringing a lot of people from across the world to Dubai to learn and to interact. It's where Arab art and Iranian art meet. It's where the diffusion of tension between Shia and Sunnah is. It's in Dubai. That's the diffusion of the tension. Tension is created elsewhere. Tension is diffused in Dubai.
To me, this is, if you'll allow me a second of editorializing, I just ask you to consider how much airtime we devote to a group like ISIS, which has 25 or 30,000 people in it, which makes it the size of a kind of a small community college in the Midwest, that has as its, sort of ideological centerpiece things like blowing up the art of the region, versus these other places that are creating, like Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Qatar and elsewhere, that are creating cultural hotbeds of creativity and collecting art and celebrating human expression. And ask yourself which of those things is likely to survive in the long run, and which of those things has real power behind it. And then ask yourself why most of the coverage is about the one and not the other. Yes. There's a microphone, bring it up here. And just if you could identify yourself, ask a brief question, and we'll try to go through as much as we can.
Right, thanks very much. I'm Garrett Mitchell, and I write the Mitchell Report, and I want to key off something that Mr. Rothkopf just touched on, but I'll step back. Well, I was in the Gulf last fall and participated in a 3-day session in which the refrain from the crack of the bat, the first session through to the last, was all about, was expressed in a phrase that said, the Gulf, people of the Gulf no longer trust the United States, period. Not maybe, kinda, no longer trust. It went beyond the United States. It got very personal about Barack Obama, and that was long before the Jeffrey Goldberg article. So despite the good news that you bring to us, and I sure saw it when I was there, there's this other set of realities that has to do with a poisonous atmosphere between the Gulf and the United States. Among the reasons is that this piece that Mr. Rothkopf talked about, which is ISIS, and the vile face that they bring forward, it is well known, perhaps you'll disagree, that from this same region of dynamism is also the region from which a lot of the funding for the worst face and the worst side of that culture comes. I wonder if you could talk to that. First, have I misrepresented it? And second, if not, what does that say? It sort of goes back to his first question about why. And the why that's on my mind is all this remarkable cultural, political, economic advancement that's coming is also a place where the financing for the worst is coming?
As I said, for instance, the UAE, for example, has I think put a lot of strict measures against financing of extremists. You don't read the UAE's name when it comes to financing extremists around the world, fortunately. Some other cities in the Gulf, and I don't want to pick on anyone here, have had a more lax attitude, which I think is changing a lot. Unfortunately, there's several definitions of what an extremist is. So for some people, an extremist is someone who actually is violent. While for some people, extremism is someone who has, who only preaches hate. So where do you draw the line? Where on one side, if you're violent, for sure it's bad. No one agrees with. But if you're an extremist and you preach hate, does that fall within freedom of expression, or does that fall within inciting against others? For me, of course, it's the latter. It's inciting against others. But I think that people are still finding their place. I think, for instance, with Saudi Arabia, I think they've been, it's not the state that is funding some of these extremists, but it's individuals. But the government has really cracked down a lot on these people, but it's very difficult for people who have accounts in Europe and have accounts in banks internationally, and they have free flow of money. They could transfer their money from the Gulf to a European country, and from that European country or from that other banking hub, they can send money elsewhere. So it's very, very difficult to stop this funding. I think it takes a global effort, and I think they're trying hard because they know that ultimately these extremists, their target in the short and medium term might be other countries, but in the long term, their target is to go after governments of Saudi Arabia and Gulf governments.
I want to respond briefly to something because I don't think Sultan would respond to the first part of what you said with regard to, and by the way, if you would, go ahead. But and that has to do with the attitude towards the United States in this part of the world. First of all, I think it's fair to say the United States has brought a lot of that upon itself. Secondly, I think it's worth noting that if you take countries like Israel or Saudi Arabia or Iran or Pakistan, their number one or number two trading partner is China. It's not the United States. And you talked about a pivot. Mm-hmm. Asia has, the Middle East has pivoted to Asia much more aggressively than the United States has pivoted to Asia. And so the relationships are deepening there. And what it does is it suggests that the U.S. narcissistic view, if you have a bad relationship with us, you're really screwed, is not actually necessarily true. If you have a bad relationship with us, there are a lot of people who have a good relationship with you. And when it comes to issues like terrorist funding, if you decide that you're against terrorist funding, you got to play by one set of the rules. And, one set of rules says, the Emirates stop it and they'll help you with it. And the Treasury sets up an office there and they should be rewarded for that. And yet they and others in the Gulf see the U.S. drawing back. Meanwhile, the Iranians, who are the largest state sponsor of terror in the region through Hezbollah, are being rewarded with better relations and more cash coming in. And so it's a little bit confusing. So I think we've earned the souring of the relations much more than anybody has provoked it. And that's not minimizing the pernicious nature of the funding of extremists from this part of the world. Let's go right here. I'll get to this side of the room. I will be equitable in all respects, front, back, gender, and age.
Hi, my name is Erin. I'm a former literature professor at Qatar University. I've been following your writing for quite some time. And I wonder if you would ruminate a little bit about your switch from, not switch, but slight change from politics to art, and why that has happened and how it helps sort of field your goals.
Of course.
So you're right. I've slightly, I think, added art as a dimension that I wanted to write about. So if you look at my articles for MEI and other publications, I still write about politics, but it's just depressing. You know, for me as a Middle Easterner, I'm so sick and tired of, you know, writing about sad stuff and depressing stuff. And there's so much beauty, there's so much creativity and innovation that is coming from the region that nobody really writes about. So I felt like part of me wanted to highlight that. Part of me also wanted to kind of fight against the stereotypes against Gulf people. One of my articles was in response to an individual who said, well, the Gulf states don't really have arts and culture. So I had to research it, and someone had to write it. And if I kept writing about politics, as I think David was very eloquent in the beginning when he said that this is more of a longer term shift. If you pick up any of the articles that I write about arts and culture, you could read it in a year or two, it would be relevant. But if you read my article about, you know, viewership of Al Jazeera in 2013, it really isn't that relevant today. Things have changed. You know, the Egyptian government was overthrown, etc. So I also try to be a bit more positive in life in general, and I hope more people would write more about arts and culture and maybe less about politics. That's what we need.
I, by the way, strongly agree with that. The reality is, you know, we talk about ISIS, we talk about extremism. What is their message? And we talk about how do they reach hearts and minds, and then we have a politician give a speech. When a politician gives a speech, people think he's asking for something or that she is asking for something. When an artist gives a performance or creates a work of art, people feel they're giving them something. They open up, a connection is made possible. Culture can change belief systems in ways that politics cannot. And we don't use the tool. We don't even have a serious discussion about it. We talk at great length about the ways we can destroy a society. We don't talk at sufficient length about the ways we can tap into the creative energies of that society to produce future growth and change. And so, you know, this makes an enormous amount of sense from a purely pragmatic point of view. Yes, you.
Thank you. My name is Sausan Gad. Sultan, David mentioned zero-based budgeting as one of the ways that the sprint basically happened. And zero-based budgeting usually depends on a political philosophy behind it or political framework. So I don't know if there's a manifesto or something that has the political vision behind the budgeting that we can read to, you know, understand the story behind this picture. This is a very nice picture, but I want to understand how much of it is scripted, as in not like free market based. So in that sense, I want to understand because my worry is that if all of this is economic advancement without political and cultural advancement, it will be very fragile. And my anxiety is that I want this to not be the case. And then because you're very interested in culture, and it's related to that. I'm trying to see if once you talk about art, this requires a lot of commitment to freedom of expression. So until now, I imagine Dubai didn't have a problem because you're always talking about antiquities and historical art, and there is safety in that you don't get to challenge, you don't get to anger so many people. But once people start doing contemporary art, that's when we get in trouble. So if you could just highlight some of the political philosophy aspect related to culture and freedom of expression that would make the art scene what it's supposed to be. Thanks.
Thank you.
I agree with you. Art will not flourish without freedom of expression and freedom for artists to express themselves. And for us, we have never been told not to put up an artwork, but in addition to government restrictions, because we live in the Gulf, we have other restrictions that you might not understand here living in America, whether it's tribal restrictions. If an artwork is insulting to a tribe or an ethnic group or a minority or something that maybe you don't have here in the middle, in the West, I have to be careful. If I, if I put an artwork that says this artwork is representative of this ethnic group in the UAE, I could be, offending them, and this is something I don't want to do. But I've never had this. We've shown political art. In fact, if I had a choice of political or non-political, I would always choose political art. We've shown. I'm not sure if I should say this on camera, but we've shown nudes, somewhere in the Gulf. We've shown a lot of political art that I don't want to get curators in trouble, because part of the fun really is to do it without authorities noticing that it's nude or noticing that it's political or the message behind it. So there is an element of fun that I don't want to lose. But definitely, if you go visit artist studios in Dubai and the rest of the Gulf, you will see they're very, very brave. What the topics they're tackling are topics that that you would see artists anywhere in the world tackle. Can you show it in public? In certain places, yes. So can you show it in a gallery where families visit? Maybe not. Maybe you shouldn't. But can you show it in a gallery that is sort of the crowd is more adult? Yes, you can do that. So and also now everything's online. I mean, even the works that we have that we don't display always in the Gulf, they're all online. You can go see them. So the ones that are political in nature. And again, I could use this opportunity to tell you that we're doing a show here in Washington next year at the American University Museum in September 2017. That's going to be a super political show. So I don't want to give anything away now, but it's going to be a very interesting show, I think, very contemporary.
We'll go up in the front and then work my way back here. Now, one more row forward. There you go. This gentleman.
Thank you very much. I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with Pakistan American League. We try to subscribe for enduring US-Pakistan relations, which are difficult and complex anyway. I will say that you mentioned about these slides and developments, the visitors, trade shows, expos, business deals, tourists coming. And the income generating source was single originally, and that was oil. And the graph had been going up for these cities. Have you ever thought that something can go wrong? Have you ever thought that all these structures, this technology, where does these cities stand when it comes to science, technology, research, manufacturing sector, and self-sufficiency, if ultimately you have to sustain and survive on your own? Thank you.
That's a great question. There's no such thing as self-sufficiency in the world today. This is a global environment. People rely on each other. Pakistanis trade with the rest of the world. We trade with Pakistan. We trade with Asia. We even trade with Iran. So there's no such thing as complete self-sufficiency. We need to import water. We need to import certain products, but we also export a lot. The UAE has invested heavily in innovation, in science and research. We have a global drone competition, Drones for Good, for example. The world competition is a Dubai competition. The Museum of the Future opened 4 days ago in Dubai. It looks like it's sort of an MIT Media Lab for Dubai. There's a lot of innovation, a lot of young.
They're so advanced that the Museum of the Future is already a thing of the past.
And also, again, I really like your point. I think the fact that Dubai went through a major financial crisis, 2009, shows how resilient it is, because it's bounced back, and it's even stronger than before. So I think every crisis that we encounter is an opportunity to learn. So if you asked me this question in 2010, my answer would be, I'm not really sure we can pull out of this. But now it's been 7-8 years since, I think we're doing very, very well.
And you go, it's a fascinating thing. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a goal of a Mars probe by the 50th anniversary of the founding of the country, so 2021. The lead scientist on that, by the way, is a woman. but you go to MIT in the Emirates, or you go to the NYU campus on the Emirates, and you see something quite different. And I just say this as a visitor, not with anybody at stake in the game, but I went there and somebody said, oh, go to this poetry slam. There was a poetry slam taking place at the NYU campus. Yeah, that's how I roll. And so I said, okay, I'll go to the poetry slam. And there were these kids who would stand up and they would do, poetry in kind of the same urban style that you'd hear here. But one guy came up and they introduced where they were from. And one of the guys came up and he said, let's hear it for K-Town. And I was like, K-Town, what's K-Town? And he said, Khartoum, I'm here from Khartoum. And it was like, it's not just that these institutions of higher learning, you can mention the Cleveland Clinic, you can mention the Science Prize, you mentioned Masdar in what it's done in green innovation, are happening in these places, but it's spreading the effect on other countries in the region. Yes, over here. We'll move one row back.
Thank you very much. I'm John Limbert. I teach history and political science at the U.S. Naval Academy. And thank you for a fascinating presentation, Sultan. Could you talk a little bit about the attitude of these places, the places you mentioned in the Gulf, toward the diversity of their own population? Not the expat. I'm not talking about the expat, but the diversity of the, what do you call, the national population or the citizen population. I know you have written and spoken about this a lot in the past. In fact, the name of your consultancy reflects that. The Barjeel reflects that.
It's an art foundation, not a consultancy.
Exactly. Oh, sorry, the Art Foundation. But I gather that message sometimes has had a mixed reception in the local environment.
We've got 5 minutes, so if you could have a 1 or 2 minute answer, I'll go to one more question.
Okay. Well, I think we have a very lively and diverse local population in the Gulf states. Let's just talk about the UAE, for example. We have citizens who have African background, who have Arab background, who have Iranian background, who have a local sort of background from the coastal Gulf. So I think it adds to the strength of the country. I called for giving citizenship to some expatriates. I think it's a debate. So a lot of people weren't happy with what I wrote, but funny enough, a lot of people were also interested in it and agreed with me. But it's a debate that needs to take place, and nobody should pressure the country. I stand on one side. I might be a minority, but I think with slowly changing one mind at a time, by the time I'm older, I'll be able to convince more people.
All right, right over here. There's a microphone.
Abad Alawi, USUA Business Council. Similar to actually the question that was just mentioned, I just wanted to know, so Saudi Arabia with their recent Vision 2030 plan announced that they possibly could give green cards to their to expats. So I was wondering what your opinion was, what you think the UAE federal government's opinion is, and how that affects the Emirati population itself.
I can't speak for the UAE federal government. I think I'm the last one who should speak for the UAE federal government. But I think it's an exciting proposition. I'm personally very excited about what Prince Mohammed bin Salman is doing in Saudi Arabia. I think it's late, but it's better late than never. I think Saudi needs the reforms, diversifying away from oil, accountability, transparency, the things that he is promising that he's going to introduce in Saudi Arabia. And we've already started seeing it happen. I'd like it to go about 1,000 times faster, if not faster than that. But I think it's a great initiative. With regards to the green card, it's something I called for in the UAE, and I think it's something that as long as it doesn't include political rights, people won't mind so much. So if Saudi does it, then other countries in the Gulf will be more willing to do this. And believe it or not, Saudi actually has a very forward-thinking citizenship path. It's just that they don't always implement it. But I think, maybe if are we ending on this note here? I think, let me just use this to end. I think it's, I come from the Gulf. These countries are 50 years old, young, let's say 50 years young, not 50 years old. It's a very exciting time. There's a lot of things, a lot of positivity happening. I look around the Middle East, I feel sad, I feel depressed. Dubai is thriving as the region is burning. And I think we need more Dubais. I really hope that Dubai gets competition. I hope that other countries in the region give Dubai a hard time. I hope that these other cities in the region, give Dubai a run for its money, and that they all not only emulate, but they all lead, and they all become even greater cities than we are today. So I think, I'm positive. I think that, we are at the cusp of great changes. So I think I'll end with this.
Thank you. I'm a big skeptic about some of the terms we use in foreign policy, like realist, because, whoever thought that up was obviously thinking I'm a realist, and that makes everybody else unrealistic, right? And it's, of course, complete nonsense. But there is a focus within the context of realism in the Middle East, where we talk about this ally in this conflict would be better than that ally in that other conflict. And it's completely unrealistic if what we're trying to do is advance our national interests. U.S. national interests are for a prosperous, peaceful region that is more and more full of people and places that are supportive of our goals. And we also have broader interests as human beings, that these places are peaceful and prosperous and offer opportunity for the people within them. And realism would say that we have to look at the forces that are producing positive change and the forces that are producing negative change, choose between them, and put our money and our support behind those that are producing positive change. And yet what we often will do is say, here is a force that's producing positive change, and it's also doing these 4 things wrong. Let's beat up on the 4 things they're doing wrong, rather than trying to use the positive change to defeat the people who are spreading a negative message. It's not to say that we don't need to deal with or don't have an interest in promoting freer, fairer, more tolerant societies. But the reality is that in terms of some of these societies, there's actually more tolerance, more roles for women, more economic opportunity than we actually have here. And all I try to do as an objective observer is to say, what are the forces that are serving our interests, and what are the forces of the future that we have to bet on? And if I have to pick one, it's thought leadership and the kind of thought leaders that Sultan represents. And so I hope you will all join me in thanking Sultan for doing such a terrific job.